Guidance, Navigation, and Control System. NASA wanted this new computer to have an autopilot as well as guidance and navigation capabilities, so the computer further evolved into the Guidance, Navigation, and Control System, GN&C, commonly referred to as the AGC. Raytheon had to pare down the usual floor-to-ceiling computers of the 1960s to the one size of a cubic foot, approximately for the CM and the LM. This supposedly was accomplished in just over 1 year. The AGC did not store information on a disk. It was stored in read-only memory, ROM, which was a core rope memory system. This was accomplished in the manufacturing phase by weaving copper wire through and around a tiny magnetic core. The crew interfaced with the AGC using a digital display and keypad known as the DSKY, pronounced disk key, on board both the CM and LM. Mission Control at Houston also had a disk key to interface with the AGC for remote control, if when necessary. Software for the AGC was written in binary, assembly, or machine language. The interpreter was used to translate mathematical functions, and the executive managed the programs. NASA claims that the AGC was capable of running several programs at the same time, and although NASA claims that the AGC had autopilot, it did not have autonomous capabilities for finding solutions to the many scenarios that could have endangered the Apollo missions and, of course, the astronauts. Trajectory and docking using the non-autonomous AGC. One of the many important procedures for the Apollo spacecraft in maintaining a programmed route to the Moon was to fire the engine of the S-1VB for a limited time for translunar insertion, TLI. This is done to put the spacecraft on a proper trajectory to the Moon. If engine thrust was precise, it would have to put the CSM on its proper trajectory, that is, an elliptical orbit around the Earth extending to the far side of the Moon. This is the free-run trajectory, which would have put the Apollo spacecraft on a course around the Moon and back to the Earth in the case of a service module engine failure. It's interesting to note that the subsequent Apollo missions gave up the free-run trajectory for the hybrid trajectory. This was apparently done to save fuel, putting them on a trajectory to their respective moon landing locations. NASA considered the risk of an SM engine failure to the minimal, therefore they gave up the free-run trajectory. That would have been an enormous gamble to take in a manned mission with one engine 240,000 miles from Earth. Proponents of these missions have argued that the LM descent engine could have been used as a backup. However, the LM engine wasn't as powerful as the CSM engine, and given the flimsy design of the LM, it's quite conceivable that the structural damage would have taken place during the Saturn V launch due to atmospheric forces. There are a number of scenarios that could have seriously damaged the LM, therefore, relying on that as a backup would have required its own backup. After the S-1VB fired its engine to put Apollo 11 on its trajectory to the Moon, it was followed by a separation by the CSM, which would have had to use its RCS thrusters to move away from the S-1VB. The CSM would then have to turn 180 degrees to move towards the S-1VB to dock with the LM to extract it. The CSM, now docked with the LM, would then have needed to turn 180 degrees back to its original position for its continued trajectory towards the Moon initiated by the S-1VB. Complicated maneuvers like this were supposedly done by a non-autonomous computer. The astronauts would have been marooned in space. Apollo 11 CMP Michael Collins claims that the Apollo method of navigation had an accuracy of 0.01 degrees. Author Ralph Renee writes, Collins says that he was thrilled when the unit flipped up its 5 balls in praise, but this represented 0.01 degree accuracy, not an exceptional result by today's standards. There are 60 nautical miles to a degree, and 0.01 degree equals 0.6 nautical miles. Many navigators on small wave-tossed boats equal this performance. Works well in small boats and planes, but on a 480,000-mile round trip? Ralph Renee continues on with an in-depth examination of his book using an analogy. I'll use a variation of that analogy to show how easily a spacecraft moving through the vacuum of space can, for a variety of reasons, move off course. There's a method general aviation pilots use to check their track, called the 1 in 60 rule. This means that when you've traveled 60 nautical miles and are 1 degree off course, you are now 1 nautical mile off course. It's an easy situation for pilots to correct along cross-country trips, especially with map readings and references to ground terrain along with navigation equipment, that is, if you correct your track promptly. But with the Apollo missions, we're not talking about a cross-country trip. we're talking about a 480,000-mile round trip in cislunar space with little or no tracking capabilities, with only the stars as a visual reference, using a non-autonomous computer. Now apply a version of the 1 in 60 rule to these factors. The speed of the CSM while decreasing due to Earth's gravity until the equigravisphere neutral point, and where the Moon begins to exert its gravitational influence due to the Apollo spacecraft's track. The Moon is on its orbit, moving at a speed of 2,300 miles an hour, which traveled about 155,000 miles in its orbit around Earth as it moved into position for the planned interception by the Apollo spacecraft. The celestial method of navigation, using a non-autonomous computer that required interface by the astronauts for specific programs. Also, the lack of visual references, that is, the limited options and star sightings available for navigation. Having no radio navigation equipment comparable to the technology and precision in navigating as aircraft have, and having little or no tracking capabilities of the Apollo spacecraft from mission control. These points require an autonomous computer for complex calculations. The AGC did not have this capability, so with the above points factored together, the Apollo spacecraft would have moved off course by thousands of miles for a number of reasons, requiring a delta V, or change in velocity and direction, that needed to use propellant to fire the engine for putting them back on course. And because of the weight restrictions for getting into orbit, propellant was limited, so there wasn't much, if any, margin for error. The method of navigation used by the Apollo missions was to check to make sure that they were on course, not to maintain it. The AGC didn't have this capability, which was why checking for any necessary course corrections was done in the first place. This is one of the many scenarios for the limited performance that the AGC would have to deal with. If this method of navigation were used in actual conditions, this would have been a sure-shot recipe for disaster, marooning the Apollo mission astronauts in orbit in cislunar space for eternity. Tracking Apollo missions the NASA way. Now that we've established that the AGC was not capable of maintaining course, how did the astronauts know when to make course corrections? The answer is they didn't. NASA had to come up with a method for tracking the Apollo spacecraft so that they could inform them when to perform a course correction. Aircraft tracking and navigation is accomplished with ground and other onboard equipment, but on spacecraft there are limits to how much weight can be launched. Therefore, everything possible is done to keep it to minimum. For the Apollo missions, a way had to be determined to track the spacecraft, since radar had a limited range and this needed to be done without bulky equipment and excess weight. The method NASA came up with was called the Doppler effect. This was supposedly done by Mission Control in Houston, Texas. The Doppler effect is usually likened to the horn of an oncoming car, which appears to rise in pitch as it's moving toward the observer, and then appears to decline in pitch as it moves away from the observer. The actual pitch of the horn never changes. The same method is applied in radio frequencies from the Apollo spacecraft when moving away or towards Earth tracking stations. However, because of the thermal extremes of space and the excessive equipment needed on board a spacecraft to send signals of sufficient strength using this method, NASA says it found a way to use the Doppler effect without the need for this excessive equipment on the CM. Given that a powerful, accurate radio signal would in any case be sent to the spacecraft to carry voice and data from mission control, engineers simply arranged that it be modified on board in a known way and retransmitted back to the ground, this time carrying voice and data from the spacecraft. If the frequency of the signal from Earth was precisely known, then so was the spacecraft, if it were not moving. After equipment on the ground received a downlink from the spacecraft, the precise frequency was compared to the uplink. A lower frequency meant that the spacecraft was moving away from the ground station, and a higher frequency meant that the spacecraft was moving towards the ground station. NASA claims that this modified method could determine the CM's distance to an accuracy of about 30 meters, which avoided the need for excessive onboard equipment. The Doppler effect method. So precise that it could have been used to track the CM and allow mission control at Houston to radio the astronauts to make a course correction if needed, based on tiny Doppler shifts in radio frequency that determine the CM's position to an accuracy of 30 meters anywhere on a 480,000-mile round trip in cislunar space, without the necessary equipment on board the CM, relying on no disruption in radio frequency. Radio and communication failures happen all the time, even with today's more sophisticated network. However, since radar wouldn't have the range needed to track spacecraft in cislunar space back then, NASA had to come up with a method of tracking the Apollo spacecraft in a way that would at least convince the public. Yet NASA had said that this method worked perfectly for all of the 9 Apollo missions that supposedly went beyond low Earth orbit. And if it seems NASA was stretching its navigation technique a little, the Apollo 13 incident was another story altogether. Theatrics at its best. On April 13, 1970, Apollo 13 had an oxygen tank explosion in the service module while docked with the LM en route to the moon. Although technically it was an electrical fire that caused an overpressurization and rupture in oxygen tank number 2, which damaged oxygen tank number 1. However, the overpressurization was enough to blow the side panel off the service module SM. In the astronauts' heroic attempt to save their spacecraft, they abandoned their moon landing and powered down the CM to save power, which they would need for re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. Since the CM was powered down, that meant that the AGC was powered down as well, which meant no navigation system. They had to rely instead on the LM's navigation system to get them back to Earth. But because the LM's primary guide and navigation system, the PGNS, would have used too much power, which was now limited, they instead used a backup computer, the LM's Abort Guidance System, AGS, to help navigate back to Earth. Meanwhile, the explosion in the Apollo 13 SM was now venting particles, which was complicating their ability to distinguish them and the star sightings needed for position fixes and course corrections. So now the astronauts are in a serious life-threatening situation in which they have to resort to using a non-autonomous backup computer with even less power and memory than that of the AGC. And while there were contingencies that included using the LM descent engine in the case of the CSM engine failure, apparently none of them included the Apollo 13 scenario. There's a possible reason for this. At the time of the Apollo accident on April 13th, 14th, 1970, this Frau Moreau site was actually a considerable distance into the unlit side of the Terminator. This is such a crucial point that we sought verification on the circumstance from Dr. Percy Seymour, astrophysicist and principal lecturer in astronomy at the University of Plymouth, England. Percy confirmed that this was in fact the case and kindly supplied us with his own computer printout illustrating the position of the Terminator at 23:30 hours GMT on April 13, 1970. Apollo 13 was inadvertently scheduled to land on the unlit side of the Terminator in an area called Frau Moreau. All of the missions were scheduled to land on the unlit side of the Terminator since their only lighting was the sun. This had been confirmed by other authors using program software called Celestia, a 3D astronomy program created by Chris Laurel. Somehow, NASA miscalculated the landing of this fictitious mission, so they needed to come up with a solution. Therefore, the Apollo 13 accident scenario was invented to rescue NASA from embarrassment. They obviously made a blunder in planning this mission that it would have landed in the dark. Proponents have countered that Apollo 13 would have landed near the moon's Terminator on the sunlit side. However, given the close proximity to the unlit side and the fact that the astronauts were using visual landmarks searching for a suitable landing site, their approach left no margin for error. This would have been hazardous to say the least. Charts and slide rules. The Apollo mission's method was to use the AGC along with charts and slide rules. Mission Control in Houston would send information by voice to the astronauts for mid-course corrections, not digital data. This required communications and data uplinks to be 100% reliable. There is the probability factor, which usually gives a high percentage of success and reliability, but there are usually backup systems to increase that reliability. With the Apollo mission's method of navigation, there was no backup system. This contradicts the safety factor for a manned mission on a 480,000-mile round trip in cislunar space. A realistic manned mission in cislunar space would require an onboard autonomous computer with the necessary speed and memory capacity for any scenario encountered on a 480,000-mile round trip. That would require programming into the onboard computer software memory a reference frame for navigating, which was supposedly done. But as has been established, the AGC required crew interface, which would have been time-consuming and inaccurate to say the least. Realistically, the AGC would have needed an autonomous capability for solutions including constant updates by the nanosecond of the Earth and Moon's orbiting position in relation to the Sun, stars, and most importantly, the CM. And note, this would have to have been done in real time. The AGC would then use the data to update projected propellant requirements, velocity, and estimated time en route to numerous checkpoints on a continuous basis, very much like what is done in aviation. As soon as a course correction is necessary, an autonomous computer instantly finds solutions, performs a maneuver, while alerting the astronauts through digital displays. The AGC did not have this capability. The limited capacity and memory of the AGC. As mentioned earlier, the AGC required crew interface for altering, updating, or switching to another program. For added safety, the main computers at Houston would have been running the same programs for comparison. In fact, NASA claims that the mainframe computers at Houston did the most complicated or biggest part of the computations, which were then uplinked to the onboard AGC. That alone raises some serious questions as to the efficiency of the AGC and the safety of the manned mission in low Earth orbit or beyond using this limited technology. It has been said that the AGC has less computing power and memory than that of the average pocket calculator. This is true considering that the AGC had a memory capacity of 38,000 words, which is a fraction of any modern personal computer. Proponents of the Apollo missions counter this by saying that unlike today's computers, the AGC didn't have the need for running numerous other programs like displaying video. However, the average modern-day computer isn't responsible for the lives of manned missions outside of low Earth orbit in cislunar space on a 480,000-mile round trip. The information that was uploaded to the AGC, or voiced up for the astronauts to write down, relied on the uplink and the communications being 100% reliable. But even with the uplink, it still doesn't consider the need for a computer to find instant solutions to any emergencies in cislunar space. Example: an environmental system failure, or averting possible celestial debris, where even a second's delay could spell catastrophe for the crew. In a perfect world where absolutely nothing could go wrong, maybe the AGC might have been able to barely complete its task, theoretically that is, and possibly in low Earth orbit, and even that's a stretch given its purported limited memory as claimed by NASA. Computer engineer Xavier Pascal writes, "Some say that it was not important if the Apollo guidance computer was underpowered because it was the mainframe computers back on Earth that were calculating the trajectory of the Command and Service Module CSM. It is totally impossible for these computers to calculate in advance the entirety of the trajectory commands to the engines because commands to an engine are only approximate and there is always a slight margin for error. Over time, such errors accumulate and become significant. The delay in sending commands from the mainframe computer in Houston to onboard AGC is about 1.25 seconds and the same time for the signal to come back. That's a total of 2.5 seconds, which may not seem like much, but in fact it is quite long in the case of an emergency. There would have been a further time delay for Houston's mainframe computers in finding solutions to a specific problem since data was sent up by voice communications, which now translates into minutes. An emergency can spell the end of a mission in seconds. You don't have minutes waiting around for mission control back on Earth trying to figure out a problem. Xavier Pascal made comparisons of the AGC to a UNIVAC computer of the same era. Although the core rope memories of the two computers display similarities, they work in a very different manner, the wires passing through or bypassing the cores being sense wires in the case of the Apollo memory, these wires being activation wires instead in the memory of UNIVAC. In the case of the UNIVAC memory, each core had a unique sense wire, so there was no problem regarding the division of current in the sense wires as with the memory of Apollo. And that fact makes a whole difference between a core rope memory which can work and one which cannot. In fact, Pascal's conclusion regarding the AGC is startling. In short, this computer had no memory, none at all, neither ROM nor RAM. With the disk key unit which was not working correctly, the AGC definitely appears to be a complete fake. But if this Apollo guidance computer was a joke, it was because the engineers intended it to be so, and not because they were incompetent. The engineers placed incoherence absolutely everywhere. All the electronic interfaces were stuffed with intentional errors. The AGC's performance can be summarized as follows: low computing power, no memory, non-autonomous, a complete fake. Where exactly is the equigravisphere? There's one more curious anomaly, and that is regarding the equigravisphere, the point at which Earth and the Moon exert equal pull or gravity, also called the gravitational neutral point, which was necessary for the calculated neutral point CNP at the date and time of Apollo 11. After TLI, the Apollo spacecraft would have needed to be precise in reaching the CNP while factoring in its corresponding decrease in forward velocity due to a pull of Earth's gravity. At the CNP, Apollo 11 would then enter the influence of the Moon's gravity, therefore increasing forward velocity. So, the pre-calculated time in mission planning becomes vitally important, since any discrepancy would require the use of propellant, which was limited due to weight restrictions for launch. Isaac Newton calculated the equigravisphere at 215,000 miles from the Earth and 23,900 miles from the Moon for a total distance of 238,900 miles. Discrepancies in the CNP for the date and time of Apollo 11 are as follows. The Time magazine issue of July 1969 listed the CNP as 43,495 miles from the Moon. In 1981, David Baker's Space Technology lists the total distance to the Moon as 253,475 miles. He did not publish the CNP, but his total distance between the Earth and the Moon differs from that of Isaac Newton. David Baker was involved in the Apollo 13 mission. Space Travel, a History. An update of history of rocket and space travel by Wernher von Braun, Frederick I III Ordey, and Fred Durant lists the CNP as 43,495 miles from the Moon. This corresponds to the Time magazine figures. Spaceflight and Technology, a chronology by David Baker, published in 1996, puts the CNP at 38,925 miles from the Moon and 214,550 miles from the Earth for a total distance of 253,475 miles. This total distance corresponds to his 1981 publication, but this time he has published the CNP. The First Men on the Moon, The Story of Apollo 11 by David M. Hardland puts the CNP at 33,822 nautical miles from the Moon and 186,437 nautical miles from the Earth for a total distance of 220,259 nautical miles. When these figures are converted from nautical miles to statute miles, David Baker and David M. Hardland's numbers come close, but there's still a discrepancy of several miles. For a manned mission to safely travel to and from the Moon with limited propellant on board, precise calculations are imperative. Simply put, there cannot be more than one distance between the Earth and Moon on the same date and time, and there should only be one figure for distance from a given planetary body at which the calculated neutral point, CNP, occurs. Aside from the obvious propellant required to compensate for any errors in calculation for the CNP, how would they have even known that they had reached the CNP sooner or later than expected? The AGC would not have had the capability for detecting this. Therefore, given the discrepancies in the figures above, this is another scenario in which the astronauts could have found themselves marooned for eternity in cislunar space. NASA has never explained this discrepancy. Redundancy, hand and eye coordination. As for redundancy in the case of an AGC failure, and unlike Apollo 13 without the LM or its onboard PGNS or AGS on its route back to Earth, NASA says that the command module had a second control system that could operate independent of the other systems called the Stabilization and Control System, SCS. This Stabilization and Control System, SCS, could maintain altitude and allow the crew to make accurate maneuvers and, if necessary, even manually control the SPS engine. In other words, NASA says that if necessary, the astronauts could have hand-flown the CSM 240,000 miles back to Earth with nothing more than hand and eye coordination. Chapter 4: Radiation Belts and the Earth, Intense Solar Storms, and Galactic Cosmic Rays. To glow or no glow? The Apollo missions would have had to travel through an area of radiation surrounding the Earth called the Van Allen belts. This is an area of intense radiation, and there has not been much discussion over the years regarding NASA's claim that, given the right shielding and trajectory, the Apollo missions were able to travel through the radiation belts with little or no harm to the astronauts. However, when one actually goes through the literature regarding the Van Allen belts, conflicting pieces of information become apparent. Today, NASA admits that there are many problems that need to be solved before sending manned missions through the Van Allen belts, which will be discussed in detail in this chapter. However, the subject and background radiation on Earth and in space is a very complex one, and when it comes to the latter, designing protective shielding for spacecraft isn't as straightforward as it is often presented in the media. Then there's the danger of micrometeoroids and thermal control that needs to be factored into the spacecraft shielding design as well. In this chapter, We'll focus on the dangerous radiation environment, which presents a constant threat to any manned space mission, including the area of space beyond low Earth orbit, LEO, and outside of the Earth's magnetic field. To completely block radiation in the space environment, the spacecraft requires shielding of different materials, for example, lead or enormous amounts of water. Due to the excess weight of these materials, a launch would be a near impossibility with the technology available today. Therefore, spacecraft shielding is designed to decrease the intensity of radiation to acceptable limits for the astronauts using materials that minimize weight for launches. This is what's called attenuation of radiation. It is the claims made by NASA when discussing attenuation of radiation that we'll focus on. Spacecraft shielding that would actually be needed for radiation in space and low Earth orbit and beyond, as well as for protection of micrometeoroids and thermal control, we'll be discussing in Chapter 5. Factors to consider in the attenuation of radiation and accumulated doses include 1. The overall health of astronauts, 2. Gender and age, 3. Number of previous manned missions they may have been on, and 4. The duration of any specific manned mission that they may be considered for. For example, a particular astronaut's previous mission or missions, depending on the duration of exposure to radiation, may disqualify him for any future mission. It would take many books to talk about the history and theory of radiation and its effects on people, more specifically astronauts in the space environment. However, for most of us, myself included, a brief review of some of the basics of this subject will help in appreciating the complexity involved, which I have provided in this section. Basic theory. There are 3 sources of radiation in space. 1. High radiation particles around the Earth trapped by the magnetosphere called the Van Allen belts. 2. Solar storms which originate from the Sun, which are referred to in several ways. For example, solar cosmic ray events, solar proton events, solar energetic particle events, energetic storm particle events, ground level events, proton showers, and solar cap absorption events, or as is commonly referred to as solar particle events, SPEs. Also, there are coronal mass ejections, CMEs, which are associated with SPEs. From here on in, we'll refer to the terms SPEs and CMEs. 3. Galactic cosmic rays, GCRs, which come from the Sun and from all directions outside of the solar system. Guidelines most commonly used for reference are from the International Commission of Radiological Protection, ICRP, and the International Commission of Radiation Units and Measurements, ICRU. Basic measurement units are used as a reference point in an effort to appreciate and understand some of the challenges for spacecraft shielding and the attenuation of radiation. For more detailed information, you can refer to the ICRP and ICRU.